Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. March 1990, the Old Bailey. Judge Kenneth Richardson QC summed up.
David McKenzie, you have been found guilty of two of the most appalling killings I can recall. You are a frighteningly dangerous man, and my duty is to protect the public. You will remain in Rampton until such a time it is absolutely clear to those responsible for your care that you are no longer a danger to the public.
Found guilty of 5 counts of raping a 14-year-old girl, endangering the lives of 2 elderly women by setting fire to their beds as they slept, and the manslaughter by diminished responsibility of 76-year-old Barbara Pinder and 86-year-old Henrietta Osbourne. This burglar, sadistic rapist, and self-confessed paedophile with a violent hatred of women was placed on a hospital order for an indeterminate term. As evidence, his confession was solid. His recall was vivid, and although some of the details he added or embellished, such as laying the blame on an accomplice who was never charged. Having confessed,
I want to tell you about the old lady.
Even though Robin Gray QC, who defended this notorious blabbermouth, stated,
there was not one shred of evidence beside his confession to link him to the old lady killings.
According to detectives,
he revealed details that only the killer could have known.
When interviewed by police, being racked with guilt which ate at his soul, Scottish-born and London-bred David McKenzie, who was diagnosed as a paranoid psychopathic schizophrenic, confessed to further crimes. And although his vocabulary was limited, having only a basic education, blessed or maybe haunted by a very retentive memory, with no emotion, just cold hard delivery, he recalled the details of 10 or 12 unsolved murders he'd committed, as if he was reading a set of instructions. He confessed to the murders of 27-year-old Keith Church in Hertfordshire, 79-year-old Hilda Murrell in Shropshire, 19-year-old Susan Maxwell on the Scottish borders, 18-year-old Carol Lannan in Dundee, 5-year-old Caroline Hogg in Edinburgh, and with 2 stabbings of victims who'd survived, just like 60-year-old Eileen McCarthy, who was randomly stabbed in the face in an unprovoked attack in Pimlico. His confessions were checked against the evidence, in the hope of bringing their killers to justice. But was David McKenzie the convicted double murderer, one of Britain's most sadistic serial killers? One specific case he confessed to was unnervingly similar to the killings of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne. Hilda Murrell was born on the 3rd of February 1906 in Old Stretton in Shrewsbuty. Shropshire born and bred, she was one of 2 daughters to Owen and Lily. Being middle class, she was Cambridge educated, and like her father, she became a successful rose grower, which suited her nature, being a woman of peace. And although unmarried and independently wealthy, she didn't dress like she had money. Described as highly intelligent, independent, and defiantly individual, 78-year-old Hilda was a die-hard supporter of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. If there was a march, she was on it. If there was a protest, she was in it. Whether at Greenham Common or Hyde Park, US or Soviet embassies, breaking into military bases, nuclear power stations, or missile sites. But her real bugbear was Sizewell B, a nuclear power plant in Suffolk. 3 months before she was murdered, Hilda was due to present a paper at a public inquiry into Sizewell B, which of course led to a wealth of conspiracy theories. 1 year before Henrietta's murder, and nearly 7 months before Barbara's, just before noon on Wednesday the 21st of March 1984, Hilda left Abbey Foregate in Shrewsbury, having done some shopping, gone to the bank, and purchased some tickets for a charity draw, and said by friends who saw her that she was in a good mood. In her battered white Renault 5, Hilda returned to the pleasant 3-bedroom detached house called Ravenscroft at 52 Sutton Road, where for many years she had lived alone. As she always did, she put away some shopping and dressed practically in a brown woolen coat, 2 jumpers, a woolen skirt, moccasin-type boots, a wide-brimmed hat and her spectacles. She went upstairs to the bedroom to take off her outdoor clothes. And it was then when he struck. As before, police were uncertain whether, as with Henrietta, she disturbed a burglar who'd gained entry via an already open door, or as with Barbara, he'd followed her in when she'd unlocked it. The rooms were ransacked, her purse was open, and the cash was taken, but not her checkbook. And although it was claimed that her report into Sizewell B was stolen, the police would later state this was untrue. It was also said that the wires to her landing phone were cut. Some say professionally, but some say not. But again, theft didn't seem to be the attacker's primary motive. During this 45-minute attack, in her bedroom, she was beaten and violently assaulted, rendered semi-conscious as she fought for her life against a cruel psychopathic sadist who had easily overpowered her. With a cotton ironing board cover, he tied her hands to the upstairs banister, locked the doors and drew the curtains. With her screams impossible to hear, having partially stripped her and exposed her abdomen and her chest, he sexually assaulted this elderly lady and masturbated over her, ejaculating on her body, mopping up his filthy seed with some tissues. And then he helped himself to a can of beer. But his attack was far from finished. With a knife taken from her kitchen, he untied her, and either while she was still unconscious or semi-conscious, he dragged her to her car. And with her slumped in the passenger seat, at speed, he drove 6 miles from her home, far from anyone she knew or any place she felt safe. Between 12:45 p.m. and 1:10 p.m, the white Renault 5 speeded and swerved up a back route to Newport, up Munkmore Road, Telford Way, Heathgate's Island, Sundawn Road, and up to Helmond Hill. As she slowly came to, Hilda saw that she was nowhere, speeding down an unrecognizable isolated lane with fields as far as the eye could see, and sat next to a man with a knife in his hand who had very bad intentions. With no houses, farms, or people nearby, she was alone. But she knew to survive, she had to fight back. As it drove along Hulkington Lane, she grabbed the steering wheel and forced the car into the ditch. With it stalled, he tried to get it moving again, but it wouldn't. And even though he tried to put a book under the wheel in an attempt to give it some grip, while he was distracted, she pocketed the car key and fled. 78-year-old Hilda ran as fast as she could in her light moccasin boots, fleeing down the lane from this man who meant to do her harm. But being younger, stronger, and faster, he soon caught up with her. And with a foul rage brewing and his attack far from finished, it was in a cornfield that he savaged her. No one heard her cries, no one came to her aid, and no one saw her die, except the sadist himself. A man in a grey suit was later seen running nearby, but nobody thought anything of it. At 3:30 p.m, Mr. Scott, a local man, was seen walking near the moat where the body lay, barely alive. But being in a hollow and with her brown clothes blending into the cornfield, he saw nothing. Later that afternoon, with her paralysed but still breathing, a police patrol spotted Hilda's car, but not her, and radioed it in as a traffic accident. with license plate LNT 917W identified as Hilda's. They called it a home, which was locked up with the curtains drawn. And by the next day, without having failed to return home, police gained entry. Inside, her post was on the floor, milk on the doorstep, and although the lights were on, no one was home. With no signs of any forced entry, they only suspected a burglary when they saw that the rooms had been ransacked. But it was as they ascended the stairs, they saw that something more sinister had occurred. There was no blood, but a sexual assault had occurred in the bedroom. She had been restrained using an ironing board cover on the stairs, and sperm-soaked tissues lay upon the floor. But still, for 3 days, Hilda remained missing. On Saturday the 24th of March 1984, at 10:25 a.m, a gameskeeper's wife from Hulkington was walking by the moat, 500 yards from the road where the car had ploughed into a ditch, when she found Hilda. 200 yards from her body, her boots were found 20 yards apart in a cornfield, and with her glasses and hat further away, this showed a trail of fear as she'd fled for her life, only to be chased and dragged to her death. Dumped in a hollow next to a tree, her body was found lying on its right-hand side, her right arm bent and in front of her as if she was reaching out for help. Still wearing a semen-stained brown woolen coat and 2 jumpers, the stocking of her left foot was initially missing, but encircling her body were the clothes her killer had scattered. The stocking, her skirt, and her suspender belt, but the knickers were gone. With bruises to her face, she was beaten when he caught up with her. With both knees and shins cut, muddied and scuffed, it was clear that he dragged her by her front, or maybe made her to kneel as he assaulted her. In a nearby hedge, the knife he took from her kitchen was found, stained with her blood, the blade matching the defensive wounds to her hands, as 4 times he'd stabbed her in the abdomen. With pathologist Dr. Nathaniel Carey stating,
"A weapon had been held to her stomach, penetrating the skin in several places, which may have led to pain and distress."
as if the plan was to punish or torture her. But his cruelty was far from finished. Having been viciously stabbed multiple times in the stomach and the liver, slowly she bled to death. But it wasn't this that killed her. Being dumped in an isolated part of a remote field, from just after 1 p.m. when she was stabbed, she was still alive and lying there, silent and afraid, until the early hours of the next morning. When after hours of pain and confusion, only being semi-clad, she died of hypothermia. Like Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne, the murder of 78-year-old Hilda Murrell was a massacre. But was she murdered by convicted double killer David McKenzie? The similarities were startling. A lone elderly lady initially attacked in her bedroom, having disturbed a burglar who'd broken in, ransacked the room, and stolen little, if anything, only to dedicate most of his time to beating her unconscious, stabbing her frenziedly, torturing her for fun, and then fleeing unseen. This murder was hundreds of miles away from Pimlico and Chelsea, but he came from Scotland and had moved around the country. Of the 10 or 12 killings he confessed to, Hilda Murrell's was the most similar to Barbara and Henrietta's. Being the earliest of the 3 old lady killings, his recall was sketchy. His retellings sometimes drifted from reality to fantasy. He embellished certain details and had even made some up, which he was known to do. And with the motives impossible to pin down, as even he couldn't say why he had killed her. When questioned by detectives, he confessed to her killing, recalling the facts from memory. On the 11th of March 1990, as was mentioned to the jury in his double murder trial, having passed the bar of proof to be tried in a court of law, the Director of Public Prosecutions accepted the case against David McKenzie in the murder of Hilda Murrell. But just like before, it was suspected that the trial might not go ahead, as being clearly mentally unstable, he would be charged, but unfit to plead. Housed at Rampton High Security Hospital in Nottinghamshire, again he was assessed by psychiatrists to continually monitor his mental capacity, but it seemed unlikely that this case would ever go to trial. 7 months later, in October 1990, the case against David McKenzie was dropped by the DPP, as even though he'd confessed, they stated,
there was insufficient evidence to bring any charges against him.
The community was shocked, outraged. A beloved woman had been brutally murdered and left to die. A psychopathic maniac had confessed to her killing, and the British justice system had excused him. Rob Green, Hilda's nephew, said of the case,
I do not accept the McKenzie story. This is a man with a guilt complex, and by confessing to the murder, he expiates it. I really do not believe that he is the answer.
As although Rob, a former naval intelligence officer, believes she was killed because of Sizewell B, there was some truth to his words, as McKenzie was never Hilda's killer. In 1992, following the collapse of the trial, Labour MP Tam Dial raised the matter in the House of Commons and petitioned for the case to be reopened. With no suspects, now that McKenzie had been dismissed as his fingerprints didn't match those at the scene, and according to Geoffrey Robertson QC,
McKenzie could not be linked to the killing of Miss Murrell,
as his blood was a different group, and having examined the semen-stained tissues,
her killer was infertile, but McKenzie was fertile.
West Mercia police re-examined over 3,000 statements, 500 police reports, 6,000 lines of inquiry, and more than 3,000 exhibits. And although this re-investigation led to no new suspects, with used tissues being stored, in 2003 when technology had caught up, being sent for testing at the Birmingham DNA Testing Centre, Detective Superintendent Mick Brunger, the senior investigating officer in this cold case review, said,
it was DNA that eventually led to the breakthrough that they didn't have in 1984.
In June 2003, West Mercia police arrested 37-year-old builder's labourer Andrew George of Meadow Farm Drive in Halscott in Shrewsbury, just 3 miles south of Hilda's home. Back in 1984, he was living in a children's home and was just 16 years old when he attacked, sexually assaulted and murdered Hilda. When first questioned, he lied about knowing her. But in custody at Blakenhurst Prison, when asked by his girlfriend at the time, Anne Good, how his fingerprints were found in Hilda's home, he told her a door had been open for a couple of days at her home, and that he'd gone in
just to have a look around.
He consistently denied murdering her. He admitted to only telling a half-truth to the police. He confessed to using some of the conspiracy theories about Sizewell B being the reason for her murder, in his words,
to save my neck when I was in prison.
And even though, like McKenzie, he too tried to pin the blame on an innocent man, he could never explain how his semen got on the tissues, or Hilda's clothes. Tried at Stafford Crown Court, Andrew George admitted to burglary and being in Hilda's home, but he denied kidnap and murder. In May 2005, found guilty of all charges, Justice Wakerley sentenced him to life for a minimum of 15 years. He summed up,
the last hours of Mrs. Murrell were truly awful.
And although, given the sadism and cruelty he had inflicted, the sentence was unduly lenient, as the judge had to pass it on the basis that it was done while he was a juvenile, stating,
if you had committed that crime recently, as an adult, I would have considered a whole life order. No release at all.
Detective Chief Inspector Chris Knight said,
Andrew George left Hilda Murrell to die a slow and painful death. He has lived with this knowledge for more than 2 decades, and with a fear that one day justice would catch up with him. Today is that day.
But with Andrew George convicted, and categorically confirmed using fingerprints and DNA evidence to be the killer of Hilda Murrell. Where does that leave us with the confessions of David McKenzie? Alongside the killings of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne, he confessed to 10 or 12 murders. One which seemed at odds with the others from the beginning was the unsolved murder of 27-year-old Keith Church in July 1982, who was stabbed to death while riding his bike down Hoddesdon High Street in Hertfordshire by an aggressive man in a red Cortina or a Vauxhall Viva for unknown reasons. Dying on his way to hospital, Keith Church described his attacker as 5'10" and stocky, a description not unique, but also not dissimilar to McKenzie. But with McKenzie having no links to Hoddesdon or Hertfordshire, he was thoroughly investigated as a suspect, but there was no evidence against him. And although widely reported in the press, both locally and nationally, the case remains unsolved to this day. But why would McKenzie randomly attack a man when his chosen victims were always old women or young ladies? Born in Inverness and raised in Dundee, one of the most high-profile unsolved murders that McKenzie was a suspect for was Carol Lannan, an 18-year-old part-time sex worker and mother of one from Dundee. Last seen in Exchange Street, the city's red light district, being driven away in a red Ford Cortina taxi at 8 p.m. on the 20th of March 1979. 11 days later, her naked body was found strangled in Templeton Woods, and with her handbag and clothing later found on the banks of the River Don, 85 miles away from Dundee. Over the years and decades, this case has been linked to Bible John in Glasgow and the World's End murders in Edinburgh. And with 20-year-old Elizabeth McCabe also found naked and strangled just a few yards away 11 months later, the two murders have frequently been linked together, but not to David McKenzie. It lacked the same level of sadism, torture and sex. They didn't come off the back of a failed burglary. McKenzie never attacked in public, but always behind the locked door of a bedroom. McKenzie was a self-confessed paedophile with a conviction for the rape and buggery of a young girl in Pimlico in 1986, so it made sense to take it seriously his confession that on the 30th of July 1982 he abducted 11-year-old Susan Maxwell as she walked home in Coldstream on the Scottish borders, and on the 8th of July 1983 that he abducted 5-year-old Caroline Hogg from outside of a home in the Edinburgh suburb of Portobello. Being stripped, bound and raped, their bodies were found in ditches miles from their homes, having been driven away in a van. But we know this wasn't David McKenzie. He never abducted girls. Instead, he lured them in or broke into their homes and raped them in private. These murders were entirely sexual, as based on Barbara and Henrietta's murders, McKenzie had a hatred of women, which is why he tortured them and stabbed them in the neck and the face. And besides, forensic evidence and a criminal trial has later confirmed that these girls were murdered by the paedophile and sadistic serial killer, Robert Black, and McKenzie's retelling of the case was sketchy at best. As for the other murders or crimes he confessed to, they were investigated, but no evidence was linked to him. And in many of the cases, he wasn't even in the same city, county or country at the time of the killings. So why did he confess to them? Out of cruelty? For sadistic fun? Or was he compelled to? Following the collapse of the trial into the murder of Hilda Murrell, David McKenzie was charged with wasting police time. And although this blabbermouth had confessed to a murder and seemed to know many details about it, even though the DNA sample was 20 years away from proving conclusive, his confession was a mix of reality and fantasy by a known liar, with the facts already widely reported in the press. And that's where he got everything from. The newspapers. As even though he had a low IQ owing to a limited education, blessed or burdened by a very retentive memory, he could reel off these details at will. When asked how he felt about the fact that he'd wasted police time, as his fingerprints and his blood group had proven that he hadn't murdered Hilda Murrell, McKenzie said,
I feel guilty. I still feel I did it.
In his defence, when asked about the murders of Carol Lannon, Elizabeth McCabe, Keith Church, Hilda Murrell, Caroline Hogg and Susan Maxwell, who he'd confessed to and partially derailed the investigation of, Robin Gray QC, his defence, asked,
"If someone said to you that you were miles away at the time of the killing, so you could not have done it, what would you say?"
McKenzie replied,
"I would still believe I did it."
So was this a game for him? Did it give him a sexual thrill? Or was something plaguing his mind? On the 30th of March 1990, at the Old Bailey, found guilty of the murders of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne, Judge Richardson QC summed up,
"David McKenzie, you have been found guilty of two of the most appalling killings I can recall. You are a frighteningly dangerous man, and it is my duty to protect the public."
With the jury told he was due to be tried for the murder of Hilda Murrell, justice was done. On the 7th to the 25th of July 1992, McKenzie appealed his conviction at the Court of Appeal before Lord Chief Justice Lord Taylor, Mr. Justice Simon Brown and Mr. Justice Rock. The defence pleaded that McKenzie was convicted
based on his confessions, despite known false admissions to a dozen others he could not have possibly committed.
In short,
David McKenzie is not a serial killer. He is a serial confessor.
At his original trial, both the defence and the prosecution agreed that he had an inherent personality disorder, that he was manipulative but also susceptible, that 6 psychiatrists gave differing opinions on whether he knew the difference between reality or fantasy, and that even when faced with the proof that at least 8 of the murders he confessed to, he didn't commit, he still said,
"I feel guilty."
As in his mind, he was guilty. But the jury chose to reject this and stuck with the only evidence, his confession. On the 25th of July 1992, 2 years after his conviction for the brutal double murders of Barbara Pinder and Henrietta Osbourne, the judge ruled,
"Cases depending solely or mainly on confessions have given rise to miscarriages of justice."
So with the necessary changes made to the law, David McKenzie was acquitted. As far as we know, McKenzie remains at Rampton on hospital order, being convicted of rape and endangering life. Assessed by one psychiatrist for his original trial, when McKenzie was given the details of an entirely fictional murder case, he confessed to it. When told it wasn't real, he stated,
"I still feel I did it."
This was used in his defence, but dismissed by the court, already weighed down by a wealth of expert evidence. All of the cases he confessed to, McKenzie had read about in the newspapers. And although he had a low IQ, blessed or burdened by a retentive memory, an inability to tell reality from fantasy, and a guilt complex stemming from a very disturbed childhood, even with a sketchy confession, the detectives said
he revealed details only the killer could have known.
But being very susceptible, although some of the details were deliberately not reported in the press to trap the killer, such as the knitting needle, the ballpoint pen and the chopstick, which had been used to torture Barbara and Henrietta, these confessions were taken during a week of police questioning, in the absence of a solicitor, when accidental slip-ups or deliberate coercion may have occurred. When told there were no fingerprints or DNA to link him to Barbara Pinder's murder, again McKenzie said,
"I still feel I'd done it."
Even though the police would later prove he was in hospital at the time of the killing. With Barbara and Henrietta's killings most likely linked to the same maniac, as well as the attacks on the women of Pimlico and Chelsea, McKenzie's confession and the police's reliance to use, and maybe abuse it, to solve a series of unsolved cases has let a killer go free. And with both investigating officers in Barbara's case now dead and the exhibits either lost or destroyed, it will once again remain unsolved. There was no denying that David McKenzie was a deranged and dangerous man. But what's deadlier? A law system willing to convict an innocent man using only his confession? a mentally unwell man who claims to be a serial killer, even though there's no evidence he committed any of them? Or the fact that so many cases were derailed and their killers walked free, as the police believe the confessions of a blabbermouth?